In the Middle Ages, the concept of home was very different from the modern one. They were not brick or concrete structures, but something born from the earth itself and natural materials collected and processed by hands. Our imagination often conjures up grand castles and cathedrals, but the bulk of the population, the peasants, lived in much more modest but surprisingly inventive dwellings. These homes were an integral part of their survival. Peasant homes were far from our idea of comfort. They didn't just provide a roof over your head, but were the result of tremendous collective work, incredible ingenuity, and an intuitive understanding of nature. Forget the romantic images of rural idyll. The reality was much harsher, but also more fascinating in terms of adaptation. Building a house for an English peasant was an event that brought the entire community together, deeply rooted in tradition and ritual. It was a return to basic principles, where every resource was valued and any help was worth its weight in gold. The dwellings were built not according to drawings, but according to centuries-old traditions passed down from generation to generation. Every log, every straw, and every clod of clay bore the story of the hands that worked them. This scenario immerses us in a world without construction shops and electric tools. We will learn how farmers, using only the gifts of nature and their skills, built their houses, shelters from the weather, centers of family life, and centers of everyday life. This is a story about survival, community, and the incredible adaptability of the human spirit. Get ready to learn how earth, wood, and straw gave birth to a house that, despite its simplicity, was the whole world for the peasant and his only reliable shelter. Choosing a place for the future home was a much deeper and more multifaceted process than it seems at first glance. It was not so much a rational engineering calculation as a sacred ritual rooted in deep pagan beliefs and folk signs. The peasants were not just looking for a flat and dry area. They were looking for a place that would be favorable to the spirits of the earth and bring good luck to future residents. These beliefs were so powerful that they could determine the fate of the entire settlement. Before the construction of Mtogli, various rites are performed to purify and sanctify the land, to ward off evil spirits and attract prosperity. Old people and healers who had knowledge of local signs and energy flows played a key role in this process, acting as a kind of spiritual surveyors. They had not only the experience of generations, but also some intuitive understanding of how to interact with the invisible forces of nature. Choosing a site could take weeks and sometimes even months, because rushing to such an important task was considered extremely unwise and could incur the wrath of higher powers. One of the most common and unusual methods was releasing livestock, especially cows, to a potential site. The place where animals lay down to rest or sleep was considered consecrated and favorable for construction because it was assumed that animals feel the good energy of the earth, invisible to humans. This method was based on the deep connection of the peasant with the animal world, where cattle were perceived not just as a source of food, but also as an indicator of the state of the environment. If the animals felt uncomfortable or avoided a particular area, it was a clear signal that the area was uninhabitable. For example, if cows were restless, stomped on their feet, or refused to lie down, this could indicate the presence of hidden water flows, geopathogenic zones, or simply unfavorable energy. This method was so ingrained in everyday life that its results were often considered the final verdict, not subject to challenge. An important aspect was also the observation of the behavior of wild animals and birds. The place where swallows often settled was considered especially favorable, since these birds symbolized peace and prosperity. Conversely, if the site was avoided even by wild animals, this caused serious concerns. Close attention was also paid to the movement of the sun during the day, so that the house received maximum natural light, which was extremely important in the absence of artificial light. The arrangement of windows and doors was carefully designed to capture the sun's rays in the morning and evening, ensuring warmth and dryness inside the room. The flow of water was also an important aspect, not only to determine the nearest source of drinking water, but also to understand how water will flow away from the house after rain in order to avoid flooding and dampness. It was believed that the house should breathe with nature, be a part of it, inscribed in natural cycles. They avoided the lowlands where water accumulated and chose higher ground, but not too exposed to the winds. Some communities may have performed small sacrifices, such as bearing valuable items such as coins, or even animal remains such as chicken bones or small cattle bones, at the site of the future hearth or under the threshold. This was done to appease the spirits of the earth, provide them with protection from adversity, attract fertility and prosperity, and ensure the continuity of the family line. In more archaic communities, they might even put a live bird or small animal in the foundation, believing that this would bring additional protection. Each ritual was imbued with a belief in the indissoluble connection of man with the world around him, where spirits and the forces of nature played a key role in everyday life. This was not just a choice of land for construction, but a deep sacred action that binds the dwelling to the vital forces of the area, to its invisible inhabitants and energy flows. It was believed that the correctness of this choice affects the health of the family, the yield of land, the fertility of livestock, and overall well-being. If the house was built on a bad site, it could bring troubles, illnesses, and bad luck, which made farmers take this stage especially seriously, sometimes spending months searching for the perfect shelter. It was believed that such places were either cursed or unclean, inhabited by evil spirits or the souls of the undead. In addition to purely functional and energetic aspects, there were also social and cultural considerations. The choice of location could depend on proximity to a communal well, pasture land, wood for firewood, or neighboring houses, which strengthened social ties and mutual assistance. Sometimes the wind direction was also taken into account, so that the smoke from the hearth did not blow back into the dwelling, as well as the proximity to fishing ponds or roads for trade. Every aspect of the site selection was carefully considered, based not only on practical needs but also on centuries-old wisdom passed down from generation to generation. Construction was carried out exclusively from what was literally underfoot or could be extracted with minimal effort and without attracting third-party inaccessible resources. Forget about the ready-made building mixes that we see in stores. The main glue was clay, but not just clay. It was mixed with manure, cow, horse, and sometimes, in particularly difficult times, human manure and straw. Manure, which seems repulsive and unsanitary to modern humans, was actually a miraculous component of medieval construction. It not only added strength and insulation properties to the clay, creating a denser and less susceptible to cracking mass, but also, thanks to its microorganisms, started the fermentation process. This process reduced the plasticity and stickiness of the mixture to incredible levels, making it pliable and easy to work with, and after drying, extremely strong. This made it possible to create more monolithic, strong, and durable walls that can withstand loads and weather conditions. Straw, in turn, served as a reinforcing material, preventing the clay from cracking during drying and giving it additional flexural strength. The tree was used in the most natural raw form. It was branches, brushwood, saplings that were cut down on the spot or collected in the nearest forest, unless, of course, it was not subject to feudal restrictions. The treatment of the tree was minimal. It was peeled from the bark, roughly hewn with an axe, but not dried or polished. For binding elements of frame structures, especially where flexibility and strength were required, they could use rawhide veins of animals, for example, from cattle, sheep, or pigs, or even strips of raw leather, rather than metal nails, which were expensive and scarce. These materials, after drying, were strongly compressed, creating an incredibly strong and elastic connection that can withstand the loads and vibrations of the walkie-talkie. Sometimes wooden spikes and hand-cut grooves were used, which required special precision and skill. In some regions where wood was in short supply, they could use wattles smeared with clay, creating so-called mud huts. They were light but fairly solid structures that were quickly built and could be easily repaired. Stones, if they were available in abundance, for example on stony soils or near rivers, were collected directly in the fields or from riverbeds. They were carried by hand or on primitive travois drawn by oxen or horses, which required enormous physical effort. Stones could be used to lay out the lower parts of the walls to protect them from moisture or to form the base of the hearth. In some cases, to create stronger walls, the stones could be held together with the same clay manure mixture, creating a semblance of primitive mortar. The whole process was incredibly dirty, smelly, and required constant contact with organic, decomposing materials. This, of course, made it a hotbed of diseases and infections. Skin diseases such as boils and boils, parasites, lice, fleas, and gastrointestinal disorders due to the ingress of dirt and germs were common for those who built these houses, making each stage of construction potentially life and death threatening. The working conditions were extremely harsh, without any protective equipment, resulting in injuries, hypothermia, and heat stroke. Nevertheless, every farmer understood that building his own house was the key to the survival of his family, and therefore he was ready to make any sacrifices. The concept of the foundation in our modern understanding, as a solid, deeply laid foundation, was simply absent in the peasant construction of the Middle Ages. The peasants did not lay deep trenches or fill in concrete belts. Instead, the most primitive methods were used, which were rather not foundations, but supports designed to somehow protect the wooden parts of the structure from direct contact with wet soil and subsequent rot. These foundations were symbolic rather than functional, and their main task was to create a minimal barrier between the tree and the ground in order to extend the life of the structure at least a little. The lack of a deep foundation also meant that the houses were subject to ground movements, which led to wall deformations and cracks. Sometimes stone pillows were used for these purposes, large flat stones that were assembled manually and with minimal processing, sometimes without it at all. These stones were placed in shallow pits or directly on the rammed earth, serving as support for vertical wooden pillars of the house frame. This method provided some protection against capillary rising of moisture. However, even in this case, there were often gaps between the stones through which moisture could penetrate, and uneven subsidence of the stones led to structural distortions. The choice of stones for such a cushion was also not easy. They had to be large enough and strong enough to support the weight of the walls, and flat enough to provide stability. Dragging such stones was grueling work, requiring the efforts of the whole family and sometimes even neighbors. But most often, especially in the simplest and most quickly erected dwellings, the base of wooden pillars was simply buried directly into the ground. To extend the life of the tree even slightly, these parts of the pillars could be burned in the fire, which created a layer of coal on the surface of the tree, slowing down rotting and repelling insects. However, this method was extremely short-lived. Despite the firing, the pillars still rotted over time, which required constant repairs, replacement of supports, or even a complete rebuilding of the house every few decades. This was an unavoidable cycle, driven by the limitations of materials and technology. Rotting wood caused the entire structure to weaken, making the house unstable and dangerous to live in. In addition, the pillars buried in the ground were an ideal barrier for moisture and insect pests, such as termites, which could completely destroy the wooden elements in a relatively short time. The dirt floor of the house was not just packed dirt, but a complex, if primitive, structural element. Straw was often mixed into it, which made it a little more elastic and warmer. A thin layer of sand or hearth ash could be placed on top, which would create at least some semblance of cleanliness and absorb moisture. However, in fact, it was an unprotected base from moisture, which constantly pulled dampness from the soil. This made the interior of the house perpetually humid, cold, and inhospitable, even in summer. Such an environment created ideal conditions for the development of fungus, mold, and also attracted countless insects and rodents, mice, rats, that gnawed holes and spread diseases. Living in such a dwelling was a constant struggle against invisible danger and sources of discomfort, and the house itself was not so much a shelter as a place where people were forced to merge with the earth, waiting for the inevitable decomposition. Despite all these difficulties, the peasants continued to build their homes, adapting to the harsh realities and using all the means available to them to survive. These houses, built with what nature provided, were a living testament to human resilience and ingenuity in the constant struggle for existence. The construction of walls was a real folk art based on the wattle and daub technology, but in its most primitive and organic form. It was a process that required not only physical strength, but also collective synchronicity. It often involved the entire community. First, vertical stakes were driven into the ground, young trees or strong, straight branches located at a short distance from each other. The choice of these stakes was important. They had to be strong enough to support the weight, but flexible enough to be easily driven into the ground and then braided. The distance between the stakes depended on the availability of materials and the desired strength of the wall, but it was usually 30-60 centimeters. Between these stakes were intertwined flexible branches, willow, hazel, or any other available brushwood, creating a kind of wicker basket or lattice. This stage was labor-intensive, requiring patience and skill, as well as the ability to work with natural materials so that the weave was sufficiently dense and stable. Often, freshly cut branches were used, which were more pliable and intertwined better, and as they dried, they created a denser and more rigid structure. Then this wicker structure was coated with a thick layer of building mix, which was the heart of a medieval peasant house. This mixture consisted of clay, straw, for reinforcement and prevention of cracking, and what is absolutely amazing and unusual for us, human and animal manure, cow, horse, and sometimes pig. As additional fillers, kitchen waste such as ash and even small garbage could be used, which today seems completely unacceptable, but then it was a way of recycling and saving resources. This mud plaster was applied with bare hands, literally rubbed into the weave, layer by layer, which dried naturally under the sun and wind. The drying process could take weeks or even months, depending on the weather, and required constant moistening of the mixture to prevent it from cracking prematurely. The thickness of the walls could reach 20-30 centimeters, which provided some thermal insulation, but did not solve the problem of drafts. The walls were porous and breathable, which on the one hand allowed air to circulate and prevented the accumulation of excess moisture inside, reducing the risk of condensation and mold. However, this porosity also meant that drafts were allowed to flow freely through the house, making it cold in bad weather and requiring constant heating by the hearth. Organic inclusions in the walls, such as manure, could not only strengthen the structure, but also over time become attractive to insects and rodents that gnaw through passages in the walls, creating new sources of problems and destroying the integrity of the structure. And the process of decomposition of manure gave off a persistent, unpleasant, earthy smell, which was a constant companion of life in such a house, especially in the first years after construction. Despite all these shortcomings, these walls were a reliable shelter from the wild, bandits, and bad weather. In folk beliefs, it was believed that they could be inhabited by the spirits of their ancestors, protecting the family from evil and ensuring well-being. This connection of the house with the spiritual world gave the construction a special, sacred meaning, making it not just a structure, but a living amulet. The thatch roof was not just a structural element, but a real living organism, part of the house's ecosystem, constantly changing and interacting with the environment. It was incredibly thick, often up to half a meter or more, which provided amazing insulation from the cold in winter and heat in summer, sometimes surpassing some modern materials in their thermal insulation properties. However, this thickness created an ideal environment for small animals to live in. Mice, rats, birds, and countless insects, from fleas to beetles, ticks, and lice, often settled in the straw. They could gnaw through passages, damage the roof, and worst of all, carry diseases directly into the house, turning it into a kind of biological time bomb. Their constant movement and rustling was part of the daily routine that the inhabitants were getting used to. Long, strong stalks of rye or wheat were used for laying straw, which were collected after the harvest. The choice of cereals was important. Rye was considered the best material because of its long, strong stems, which retained their water-repellent properties longer. Solomo was laid in very dense layers, starting from the bottom up, carefully overlapping each previous layer to create the most dense and waterproof surface. It was a real art that required special skill and many years of experience. Experienced mastera nazываемые roofers, called thatchers, were able to create an almost airtight and watertight surface that could last up to 50 years with proper care and regular maintenance. Although the service life was usually shorter, about 15-20 years, due to constant exposure to weather conditions and pests, the slope of the roof was very steep, up to 45-60 degrees, so that rainwater rolled down as quickly as possible without penetrating into the thickness of the straw, which prevented rotting and moisture penetration inside. Wooden stakes, ropes made from plant fibers, or, in later times, special metal staples were used to secure the straw. One of the most unusual aspects was exposure to smoke. Smoke from the open hearth inside the house rising through the straw pumped it. This not only created a specific, pungent, but familiar smell inside the dwelling, which was deeply absorbed into clothes and hair, but also, oddly enough, made the straw less attractive to parasites and extended its service life, acting as a natural preservative. Soot and tear impregnated the straw, making it more resistant to rot and pests, creating a natural protective layer. Nevertheless, the air in the house was constantly suffocating and acrid, saturated with combustion products, which negatively affected the health of the lungs and lungs of the inhabitants, contributing to the development of respiratory diseases. The roof was not just a protection from precipitation, but also a symbol of protection from the wrath of heaven and the elements, and its safety was considered a guarantee of the well-being and stability of the family. Damage to the roof was considered a bad sign and required immediate repairs, often involving the entire community. The concept of a window in the modern sense, as a transparent element for viewing and light, was completely alien to medieval peasants. Windows were not just small, but often absent altogether in the simplest and poorest dwellings, where the only source of air and ventilation was an open doorway. If there were any, they were simply open holes in the walls, through which the smoke from the hearth came out and the scant, dim light came in. These holes were kept as small as possible to minimize heat loss, which was critical in cold winters when fuel was worth its weight in gold. However, at the same time, they served as a gateway for drafts, dust, insects, and even small rodents that freely enter and spread dirt and diseases. Instead of glass, which was an incredible luxury available only to very rich people in castles or cathedrals, primitive substitutes were used. These could be rough wooden shutters that were closed at night or in bad weather, protecting from wind and rain, but completely blocking the light and plunging the house into complete darkness. Sometimes oiled pieces of parchment or linen cloth were used, which allowed only very weak, dim, diffused light to pass through, creating a semi-darkness inside the house. However, they did not provide any transparency, just a vague, blurry image of the outside world. There was no air tightness at all. Drafts freely walked around the house through numerous cracks around the window openings, creating constant discomfort and cooling the room, which contributed to frequent colds and respiratory diseases. The doors were primitive and functional, made of rough, untreated planks that could be freshly cut and eventually crumble, leaving cracks. They were hung on simple leather hinges or simple wooden hinges, which over time could creak and loosen, requiring constant repair. Often the doors were not closed tightly, leaving significant gaps through which cold, dust, moisture, as well as all sorts of animals, from rats to domestic animals, such as chickens and pigs, penetrated if they lived in the same room with people. This was a constant source of illness and discomfort, making the house only half protected from the outside world and its dangers. The doors, in addition to their practical function, also had a symbolic meaning, opening into the outside world and symbolizing the threshold between home and fate. It was believed that you cannot pass anything through the threshold so as not to bring trouble, and that it is through it that both good and evil forces come to the house. The open hearth, located right in the center of the dirt floor, was not just a source of heat. It was the heart of the house, its central altar, and the center of all family life. Chimneys, as we know them, with a complex exhaust system, did not exist. The smoke from the hearth rose up and out through a small hole in the roof, a chimney window, which was often just a crack, or worse, through numerous cracks in the thatched roof and walls. This led to constant smoke in the room, making the air inside the house acrid, suffocating and saturated with combustion products, soot, ash, and carbon monoxide. This design, or rather its absence, was due to the lack of technology and materials, as well as the desire for maximum simplicity and cheapness of construction. Residents constantly inhaled these harmful substances, which caused chronic respiratory diseases, from persistent coughing and bronchitis to serious lung pathologies such as silicosis or emphysema. Smoke also caused severe eye irritation and inflammation, which over time could lead to permanent vision loss, cataracts, and glaucoma. Soot settled on all surfaces, on the walls, ceiling, wooden utensils, and even on the clothing and skin of the inhabitants, turning the house into a sooty, stuffy, gloomy space, more like a primeval cave than a dwelling. This created a feeling of constant darkness and crowding, increasing feelings of oppression and depression, affecting not only the physical, but also the psychological state of people. The constant smell of burning permeated everything, becoming an integral part of everyday life. The hearth was used not only for heating during the cold months, when the temperature in the dwelling could only be a few degrees higher than outside, but also for cooking, often directly above the fire on tripods or in pots suspended from chains, as well as for lighting in the dark, when the only source of light was a flickering lamp, fire casting strange shadows on the sooty walls. The presence of an open fire in a wooden or thatched house filled with highly flammable materials was a constant source of danger. Fires were a common, destructive phenomenon that could destroy all the work of a community overnight, leaving families homeless and destitute. Often it was the fires that caused entire villages to disappear completely, leaving nothing but ashes and memories behind, and forcing the survivors to start from scratch in extreme need. Fighting the fire was almost impossible, as there were no specialized tools or sufficient water. For construction, an extremely minimalistic set of tools was used, which for a modern builder would seem completely inadequate and inefficient. The axe was a basic, multifunctional tool. It was used to cut down trees, roughly cut logs for the frame, split wood for the hearth. Its blade could be primitive, made by a local blacksmith, and required frequent sharpening on stones, which took a lot of time and effort. Sharpened stakes or rough wooden shovels were used to dig holes for poles or extract clay, sometimes with a primitive metal shackle at the end, if one was available. These tools were extremely inefficient compared to modern ones, which significantly increased the time and labor costs for each stage of construction, turning it into a grueling and long epic. Hand hammers could be simple stones picked up on the field, or primitive pieces of metal, but most often they used their own hands and feet to seal the clay, hammer in wooden pins, or tamp the floor ruki inogi. This led to permanent calluses, cuts, abrasions, splinters, and other skin injuries, which in conditions of absolute unsanitary conditions were easily infected. Small scratches could turn into purulent wounds, abscesses, and even cause blood poisoning, often leading to disability or death due to the lack of basic medical care. Pain and physical discomfort were the builders' constant companions. Most of the work, especially mixing huge volumes of clay with manure and straw, as well as laying layers on the walls and roof, was done with bare hands. It was a process that required superhuman endurance and patience. The peasants worked for months in the mud, in the sun and wind, their bodies covered in dust, mud, and sweat. Every movement, every breath, was accompanied by physical exertion and discomfort. The whole process was not just time-consuming, but extremely traumatic and painful, requiring incredible physical strength and mental resilience. The lack of medical treatment meant that any serious injury, a fracture, a deep cut, a severe bruise, could lead to disability or even death, depriving the family of the breadwinner and jeopardizing the very existence of the entire farm. It was the power of survival, forged in constant physical pain, suffering, and relentless, exhausting labor, where the body was used as the main tool, wearing itself out in a relatively short time. The construction of the house was exclusively a collective event, known in English traditions as raising bior, frolic, which is similar to the Slavic toloka or pomokam. A single farmer or even a single family could not physically cope with such a huge amount of work, which required the simultaneous performance of many tasks: cutting wood, preparing the frame, mixing huge volumes of clay mixture, weaving wattles for walls, and especially the hard work of laying a thick layer of straw on the roof. Neighbors, relatives, and the entire community came together to help. This was not just voluntary assistance, but mandatory mutual assistance, part of an unwritten social contract based on mutual dependence. At a time when there was no state social security and the individual was completely dependent on the community, refusing to help could mean that the next time you had a need, whether it was building a house, harvesting crops, or rebuilding after a fire, No one would come to help. This effectively doomed them to social isolation and, as a result, to survive alone, which was tantamount to a death sentence. The community was the only insurance against misfortune. During such a construction project, people not only exchanged physical labor, but also shared food prepared by the entire community, stories, anecdotes, experiences, and knowledge, passing them on from the older generation to the younger. This strengthened social connections and imparted important building skills. However, this close contact in unsanitary conditions, dirt, sweat, lack of hygiene, it also contributed to the rapid spread of infections and diseases. Any epidemic recorded on such a toloka, for example, dysentery, typhoid, or smallpox, could cover the entire community in a matter of days, leading to mass diseases and deaths. It was not just an economic mechanism, but a deep social ritual of survival, where each member of the community understood that his life and well-being directly depend on the life and well-being of his neighbors. Community spirit was not just an ideal, but a vital necessity dictated by the harsh realities of survival. Despite the seemingly primitive technologies and materials used, many of these peasant houses were surprisingly stable and durable. Some of them, especially those that were built using a stronger frame technology, using thick oak beams, timber frame houses, could stand for decades and even centuries, being a living testament to the incredible engineering ingenuity and endurance of people. Their secret lay not so much in the quality of individual materials, but in the thoughtfulness of the design, which allowed the tree to breathe and dry out, preventing rapid rotting, as well as in constant cyclical care. Thatched roofs, despite their organic nature, with proper installation and regular maintenance, could serve for a very long time. They were periodically updated, old, damaged, or badly rotted straw layers were removed, and new ones were laid in their place. It was a continuous process that ensured the durability of the roof. Clay walls were covered with fresh mortar, and cracks that appeared as they shrank and were exposed to weather conditions were repaired. Wooden frames, if well made of quality wood, such as oak, were exceptionally strong. Sometimes they were deliberately left to breathe, not completely sewn up so that the air circulation prevented the accumulation of moisture and, as a result, rotting. These homes were a living testament to the fact that simplicity, functionality, and a deep ability to work with nature can create surprisingly sustainable structures. They were built to withstand not only bad weather, heavy rains, winds, snowfall, but also the many evils of medieval life, including feudal wars, robber raids, and looting. Due to their inconspicuousness and ability to recover relatively quickly from damage, they served as a reliable shelter. In their longevity lay the hidden wisdom of the ages, the knowledge of how to survive in symbiosis with the environment, even if that environment was full of dangers, hardships, and unpredictable events. It was a celebration of the adaptability and endurance of the human spirit. The life of a medieval English peasant was full of privation, hunger, and disease, and his home was a direct reflection of these harsh, merciless realities. It was not a place of luxury or comfort in the modern sense, but a veritable fortress of survival, built from what little land provided, and held together by backbreaking but vital collective labor. The lack of modern amenities, the constant struggle with the biting cold, bone-chilling dampness, ubiquitous dirt, and deadly diseases, all this was an integral part of their everyday life, shaping their life and worldview. However, looking at these simple, often unassuming dwellings, it is impossible not to feel deep admiration for the ingenuity and perseverance of those who created them. Farmers didn't just build walls and roofs, they created shelters that protected them from the raging elements, gave them some warmth on cold nights, and served as the center of family and community life. Their homes were the epitome of pure pragmatism, stark minimalism, and a deep, almost instinctive connection to nature. They used every twig, every rock, every handful of clay and manure, turning them into functional and vital elements of their existence. Today, when we are surrounded by high-tech materials, sophisticated engineering solutions, and automated construction processes, the history of medieval peasant houses serves as a powerful reminder that to create a home, a true shelter, you need not so much, just knowledge of your land, the ability to work with its gifts, community, and an unwavering will to survive. These non-standard construction methods, which seem wild and impossible to us today, were the only possible ones in those harsh times. And they left behind not just ruins, but a valuable legacy, a lesson in simplicity, endurance, and harmony of a person with the world around them, even when this world was cruel and unforgiving.